So let me say first, thank you very much, Professor Lee, for introducing me. And I want to thank Professor Guangxin as well for organizing this wonderful conference, and also our sponsor, Tung, Yuen. And this is a great opportunity for me to join you because I do want to share some of my thoughts on Buddhist canon, and as my topic suggests, how to open the canon. I think that's the question we all care about. Actually, I think by organizing this great conference, this conference already shown how we can open the canon. So each presenters yesterday and today, before me, Professor Park and Professor Walter already spoke eloquently about the different aspects, different issues in the Buddhist canon, and that's their way of opening the canon. So I think today I'm going to share some of my thought. I don't have a PowerPoint, but however, I have written paper. So I want to read my paper, but if you look at the chat, I just send out a short outline of my talk. So I'm going to largely follow these 6 aspects, right? So I'm going to read my paper here. Please follow me here. The title of my talk is Opening the Canon, New Challenges to Buddhist Studies in Humanities Education. The meaning of a canon can be very broad, and each canon is different. It can refer to a set of classics which has been commonly regarded as foundational in the tradition. In the Christian world, if you mention the word canon, usually it means the Bible, which is a one-book canon. In the literary world, it also means an acknowledged set of literary classics, such as Shakespeare's works. In East Asia, canon can be loosely translated as 经典, or classics, such as Confucian classics. In the Buddhist world, we use the word canon to refer to 大藏经, or the great store of scriptures. The canon is a loaded term in both the East and the West. Although there are a lot of similarities between canons in the East and the West, the Buddhist canon is more complicated in terms of its size, structure, and the canon-making process. The number of classics is much more than the biblical canon, and its structure and organizing principles have evolved through ages and remain open for creative adaptations. Under the purview of postmodern critical theory, the canon, including the Buddhist canon, represents an oppressive and authoritative force, exerting its symbolic influence on all aspects of human life. However, such a view neglects the fact that the canon is also evolving and responding to changes. The Buddhist canon in particular has been part of the communities since its beginning. In contrast to the Western canon, it's always open to new additions and interpretations. In the digital age, the Buddhist canon has been more widely distributed as both an academic subject for studies and a tool of self-cultivation in humanities education. The digital Buddhist canon is a great advancement in modern times. However, it doesn't mean that we can interact with the canon more effectively and intimately. It created the illusion that we have processed the canon through a simple search of its full text, which cannot guarantee that we have understood the canon. By using the verb open metaphorically and symbolically, here I'm referring to the title of my talk, Open the Canon. I mean that it's time to fully engage and understand the history, structure, and the content of the canon. It also means that the canon is always open to us for further engagement, such as reading, commentating, anthologizing, including changing itself to allow it to evolve in this new age. The ways of opening the canon do not limit to reading and chanting the scriptures religiously and ritualistically. It can be a collective effort of textual practice to make the canon central to our life. In this sense, this opening up is not an individual act, but communal and participatory. Yet, because of its complexity, the canon is far from opening. There is an urgent need for us to open the canon, to familiarize ourselves with its content history, and to experience its transformation in real life. This talk attempts to open the Buddhist canon from the perspective of humanities education and explore its humanistic value in a post-pandemic global society. The subject of the Chinese Buddhist canon in East Asia context is a familiar but challenging subject. It is familiar because Buddhist scholars have been dealing with the canon on the daily basis in order to make use of its vast textual repository. It is challenging because the canon and its various editions constitute a formidable text body with intricate links among themselves and far-reaching impacts on Buddhist communities. Moreover, every text and every edition of the canon has its own life, involving a great number of individuals who devoted themselves to the creation and maintenance of a canon. In front of this great textual tradition, scholars should remain humble and reverent. However, in the study of East Asian Buddhism, a scholarly arrogance over the canon has been developed. Dr. Louis Lancaster remarks about this in his preface written for our edited volume, Spreading Buddha's Word in China. So this is an edited volume I co-edited with Dr. Lucille Jia, and Dr. Louis Lancaster wrote this preface for the book, and I quoted one paragraph from his preface. By the way, this book is published in 2016. Some of my thoughts here, presented here, actually coming from that book as well. So here I'm quoting Dr. Louis Lancaster's preface. For a few years at the end of the last century, there developed what some have called the hermeneutics of suspicion. This was particularly applied to canons that were suspected of being hopelessly exclusive. In many ways, this so-called postmodern attitude hardened over time, and the ironic result was loss of flexibility in scholarship. During that time, a response to one of my papers, so this is Dr. Louis Lancaster's paper, on the Korean version of the canon was the statement, quote, "We don't use the word canon anymore. It is not current with our ideas," end quote. This signaled a sanction against even talking about what were considered to be elitist text. And its unfortunate expanded into a derisive rejection of the very idea of studying them, end quote. So that's Dr. Louis Lancaster's paragraph coming from the preface. This hermeneutics of suspicion is certainly developed from a simplistic understanding of the East Asian canonical tradition and resulted from a cheap complacency of postmodern speculation. In the following, let me try to open the canon from 6 aspects or issues which are often overlooked in canon studies. Right? So here I'm going to follow the 6 points I just sent through chat. Right? Number 1, the first one is the definition of the Chinese Buddhist canon. So far, there's no commonly accepted definition of the Chinese Buddhist canon. Even the very term of Chinese Buddhist canon is misleading because although the canon is based on classical Chinese language and originated from China, other parts of East Asia, such as Korea and Japan, also engaged and contributed significantly to this canonical tradition. Some scholars, such as Robert Boswell, prefer to use the terms such as East Asian Buddhist canons, which is much broader in its connotation and extension. Some may object to the use of canon as a singular with a definite article as Paul Harrison claims, quote, "There is no such thing as the Buddhist canon," end quote. The singular form of canon may conceal the fact that there are different editions and textual families within its tradition. The use of the English word canon can also be problematic, and the Indic term Tripitaka has often been used in lieu of the word canon. However, as Louis Lancaster shows convincingly, the term Tripitaka is not suitable to describe the Chinese Buddhist canon either, because, quote, "the housing and the subsequent listing of the texts in the Buddhist libraries of China could not be limited to the three categories of the Sanskrit classifications," end quote. And the Chinese Buddhist canon is a complex mixture of Indian and East Asian patterns. More questions can be raised about the nature of the canon, whether the Chinese canon is simply a library, archive, or mere collection of a series of selected texts if compared with the Western canonical traditions. To review the structure and the physical characteristics of this canonical tradition, primarily based on texts written in literary Chinese, Professor Feng Guangchang has made an attempt to offer a succinct definition as follows to describe the Chinese canon. So here I'm translating Professor Feng Guangchang, a retired professor from Shanghai Normal University. So he is a leading expert in the field of Chinese Buddhist canon. So here I'm reading this translation of his definition of the Chinese Buddhist canon, including essentially the translated Buddhist scriptures of past ages as the core of its content. The Chinese Buddhist canon is the collection of the Chinese Buddhist classics and the related literature organized according to certain structures and with some external identification markers. In this definition, Professor Feng emphasizes three essential elements in the composition of a canon, namely the selection criteria, systematic structure, and the physical markers. In light of this definition, the Chinese canon is not an arbitrary collection of Buddhist texts, but a conscious reassembly of a group of writings according to a well-crafted selection criteria articulated in the sophisticated compilation of catalogs, which provide systematic structures that all editions abide by. In this sense, J.Z. Smith, so I'm quoting, this is a professor from University of Chicago. So his definition of the canon as an arbitrary list of the text might not apply to the Chinese canon. Moreover, the canon is a distinctive physical existence with a unique set of external characteristics which can be identified as belonging to a specific variant of a text family. These external characteristics include page layout, because it's a printed manuscript kind of a format, so there must have page layout, calligraphic style, binding methods, printing format, and the use of a call number systems. Right? So these are all the physical markers Professor Feng Guangchang already studied. In this research, Professor Feng Guangchang has consciously used this definition to study various editions of the canon, especially the manuscript edition. Of course, his definition merits more consideration and needs to be further refined. For example, although Professor Feng did notice the religious aspect of the canon, his definition did not offer a satisfactory explanation regarding the source of its canonicity and authority, not to mention the dynamic interaction between the canon and religious community. So here is the first point I want to raise, kind of the opening up this question about the definition of Chinese Buddhist canon. So number two is the myth about an open canon. The flexibility and the lack of a rigid organizing standards in the Buddhist canonical tradition have been observed by many scholars. Paul Harrison, for example, so this is a professor from Stanford University, believes that all Buddhist canons are basically open canons, code in which commonly accepted principles of authenticity take the place of a rigidly defined and bounded set of texts in a given linguistic form, end quote. The Chinese canon is a notorious example of such open canons. Paul Swanson, for example, summarizes this widely believed idea as follows. Here is the quotation from Dr. Paul Swanson's definition. The Mahayana Buddhist canon, so he is a Japanese Buddhism specialist. So here, the Mahayana Buddhist canon, including both Chinese and Japanese traditions. So the Mahayana Buddhist traditions is relatively open canon compared to the relatively closed canon of Christianity or Islam, or even of Theravada Buddhism. It does not have a clear beginning or end. It is not bound by any historical period or geographical area. It is possible to continue to add to the Mahayana Buddhist canon. Scripture, or more accurately, the word of the Buddha, is not limited to actual words of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni. So, end quote. Professor Swanson's description gives people a wrong impression that the Chinese Buddhist canon never encounters the issue of a closure in its long history. One of the historical reasons for such openness, as Dr. Louis Lancaster points out, is the piecemeal transmission of Buddhist texts into China, which requires Chinese Buddhists to keep their collections open in order to search for the missing texts. It is true that for modern canons, which value their academic merit as collections of essential texts, the structure of the canon tends to open to changes. However, a close look at the canon formation process in East Asia reveals that after the initial opening phase of a few centuries, the Chinese canon appears to have reached to a point of closure in the mid-8th century with a serious attempt to create a standardized register of canonical texts, or 入藏录. Eventually, the Chinese canon did base itself on a core body of texts stipulated by monk Zhisheng's Yuen catalog. This is Zhisheng's 开元释教录, which fixed the size of the entire canon at 5,048 fascicles, Yuen, and 480 cases. For centuries, despite the fact that the size of the canon continues to grow, this core body remains stable without much alteration. In the popular consciousness, the canon closed with this number of texts listed in Zhisheng's catalog. The number of fascicles in Zhisheng's catalog was even mythologized in the Chinese folklore and became the standard size of the canon in popular Chinese novel Journey to the West. This is referring to 西游记. If you have read chapter 98, for example, there's an entire list of Buddhist canon incorporated into 西游记 as well. So in this chapter, Journey to the West, the Chinese canon was described as having exactly 5,048 fascicles. In reality, texts from Zhisheng's Kaiyuan catalog forms the core of the main canon, and it became a sine qua for all canons in pre-modern East Asia. The issue of the canon being open or closed raises an interesting question about the role of catalog in shaping the structure of the canon. Studies of Western canons show that the canon is basically an extension or transformation of a list, as J.Z. Smith, for example, tends to reduce the canon to a mere list or catalog of enumerative nature, which has, quote, no necessary beginning or end, and no necessary articulated principles of order, end quote. The list or catalog was transformed into a canon only because the element of closure was added. Therefore, the notion of a canon implies the idea of a closure. For the theologian Paul Ricoeur, he used to be a professor at the University of Chicago as well. The canon has to be closed because the closure is, quote, a fundamental structural act that delimits the space for the interplay of forms of discourse and determines the finite configuration within which each form and each pair of forms unfolds its signifying function. These reflections on the nature of the canon as a closed list calls for our close attention to the role which catalog played in the formation of the Chinese canon. Moreover, the case of the Chinese Tripitaka catalogs is more complicated because a register of canonical texts, Ruzang Lu, was placed within the much comprehensive catalog, which is both descriptive and enumerative. Excuse me. The nature of the Chinese canon is an open or closed system still awaits for further exploration on its historical evolution and structural changes. It is perhaps better to describe the Chinese canonical tradition as a dynamic interplay of openness and closure to avoid simplistic characterizations. So this is the second point I want to make. So the third one is about what I call the cult of the canon. The creation of a canon is a work of faith that involves a series of devotional activities in the creation, distribution, and the maintenance of the canon, and it can be referred to as the cult of the canon. This religious phenomenon has been deeply rooted in the Mahayana tradition of the cult of the book as defined by Gregory Chopin. Right? So if you can have read Professor Chopin's work, of course, this concept, cult of canon, is derived from his concept, cult of the book. Right? So he notes that the early Mahayana scriptures played great emphasis on worshiping written texts. In China, the cult of the book had been a long-standing cultural tradition that preceded the advent of Buddhism in China. And the reverence and even fetishization of works such as the Buddhist and the Taoist canons were natural developments. The Buddhist canon presents the ultimate teaching of Buddhism and the essence of the Dharma body, and is therefore the potent symbolic capital in Buddhist communities, serving as a means to connect with the origin of the tradition and to the ultimate scriptural authority. The state, elite groups, and the common people have all aspired to sponsor the production and distribution of the entire set through devotional patronage and sponsorship, ceremonial consecration and worshiping, ritual writing and reading, etc. Ownership of a canon would greatly enhance the prestige of a monastery, stimulating the growth and revival of religious devotions and attracting more patronage. In the process of its creation, the state invested a particular significance in the canon, as it was believed that the ownership of a canon could protect the nation. The Korean king, for example, had requested Kaibao canon, so Kaibao Zang, from the Song government for the security of the nation, and they later created their own canon as a way to defend themselves against the Mongol invasion. Right? So here I'm talking about the Goryeo edition. So there are two prints in Korea. And the commoners could also sponsor the project out of their devotion. The creation of a Zhaocheng canon. So this is Zhaocheng canon created in the Jurchen or the Jin dynasty, for example, was initiated by a little-known Buddhist figure called Yin Shi, and continued by his best-known female disciple, Cui Fa Zhen, who severed her arm at 13 and vowed to print a Buddhist canon. Previously, by the way, I just want to note here, we only know Cui Fazhen was involved in the creation of the Zhaocheng canon. Until recently, we discovered Stili, and it says clearly this has started with his teacher called Yin Shi. So this project was supported by lay people in Xiezhou, that's today's Yuncheng area in Shanxi and neighboring areas. More than 50 followers imitated her devotion. So this is Cui Fazhen's severing her arm, right? And they also severed their arms as well. So they collected funds by burning arms and fingers and cutting eyes and livers, and even donating all family properties and selling their children. It took them about 30 years to complete the entire canon. Cui Fazhen was allowed to be ordained and awarded a purple robe and an honorific title. So this canon later became the so-called Hongfa canon. The physical canon can be treated as a sacred object for veneration and sacrifice. Donors can adopt one title or one fascicle, or even one booklet for offering during the period of 1 year. Such adoption is renewable. During Buddhist holidays, the hall of scripture storage, right, Zangjing Lou, for example, which was designated for the purpose of veneration, was opened to these donors for worship. The canon was also regularly brought out from the cabinets to prevent dampness. This practice developed into the ceremony of summing the scripture, so-called Shai Jing. So usually that's the 6 months, the 6th day of the 6 months in the southern area, in the Jiangnan area. Right? The purpose is, of course, to expose the scripture to sunlight. It's also an opportunity for public display and respect. In the Buddhist tradition, texts have served an essential spiritual purpose for believers. The huge number of texts in the Buddhist canon has been used for ritual reading and writing. Ritual reading of the entire canon was developed when it is still in manuscript form, commonly known as turning the scripture, 转经. The activity of ritual reading inspired the invention of the revolving view storage cabinet. So here I'm talking about 转轮藏, so which was a very popular form of veneration of the Buddhist canon in the Song dynasty. Right? If you go to Hangzhou area, for example, the Gaoli Si, right, the Korean temples, if you go there, you can see a very gigantic cabinet, revolving cabinet is still there. It was rebuilt. Right? So this is for symbolic reading of the entire canon. In the Ming Dynasty, it was often referred to as reading the whole canon in confinement, right? It's called so-called 进步乐藏, so which involved solitude, worship, ablution, and even fasting. The devotees vowed to read the entire canon in 3 or 4 years for the purpose of benefiting all sentient beings. Right? So please read the Buddhist canon, right? So you can finish it, right? If you can spare 3 or 4 years. So that's the third point I want to make. Basically, reading the canon. Canon, we have to remember, this is a religious compilation. There are venerations, worship, religious aspects involved in the creation, circulation of the canon. So number 4, the fourth point I want to make is about Buddhist canon and technology of production. It has been long ignored that the canon has a distinctive physical dimension involving a process of production and reproduction by utilizing the tools of writing, printing, digitization in today's world. By the way, writing is also a technology, right? Not mentioning printing and digitization. So these are all the technology for people to express themselves on paper in a different kind of media format. As J.Z. Smith, so here I'm quoting J.Z. Smith a lot because he wrote an influential paper on canon catalogs and the classics. So here is his quotation. Canonization as a secondary process is inseparable from modes of production. It is as much a fear of technology as theology, right? So lots of people focus on theology, but actually, according to J.Z. Smith, is also a technology. Therefore, the canon is also a sacred object code that is always manufactured and all but infinitely reproducible. Even W.C. Smith, right? This is William Cantwell Smith, a professor at Harvard University, who is not a specialist in Chinese canon, but he recognized the importance of printing technology in the production of the Chinese collection. He remarked on the Buddhist canon in his famous book, What is Scripture?, that the growth of the canon code had to do with the decision of financial sponsors or of particular printers, and not only of imperial authorities or even Buddhist monks deciding what to include in the edition of the scripture, end quote. In each stage of the Buddhist canon, we can see clearly the use of a new technology transformed the canon as a physical object. During the manuscript era, the canon grew out of the flourishing scribal culture in medieval China, in which transcribing Buddhist texts was a social and religious enterprise involving devotional writing of the devotees and the use of professional scribes and the tools of writing, classifying, and binding. The use of printing was a technological revolution, which initiated further changes in the layout and the binding style of the Buddhist canon, the mode of social mobilization, and the reading mode of the public. Jiaxing canon. So here I'm talking about the Jiaxing Zang, so which was related to actually the Jingshan temple in Hangzhou, and also a Lengyan temple in Jiaxing. Right? So these temples are very close. So the Jiaxing canon created during the 17th and 18th century, for example, adopted the common format of a string bond style and greatly facilitated its circulation and public reading. During the digital age, the canon as a collection of hypertexts has some features which are completely different from the print culture. Here we're in the digital age, so there are digital canons such as Sibeta, SAT, SAT, created in Japan, for example, become increasingly popular. Right? So we have to remember the media have changed, so there are some features also change as well. In the future, as Professor Fang Guangchang predicts, the text will be no longer controlled by a single author, and the readers from online communities now can participate and interact with the canon collectively as authors as well. The canon, therefore, is not fixed, unified, or even coherent. It may become forever open to all possibilities, devoid of any linear and hierarchical structures. The changes brought by technological revolutions are obvious in the history of the Chinese canon. However, it is still unclear how these technological advances changed the way people interacted with the canon and what effect these changes brought to the canon itself. More complex is the interplay between orality, writing, and printing in the past and the digital media in the contemporary world. If the digital trend is continuing, it's very likely, especially during and after the pandemic, I believe this digital trend, right, will continue. It may suggest the process of a decanonization, right? So decanonization has occurred and tend to deprive the ultimate authority of the canon, leading to the dissipation of the canon as a coherent and a consistent whole. Right? So here I'm not offering a solution or a prediction, but simply a question. Right? So what happens if technology, if media of Buddhist canon changed? So what's our definition concept of a canon? Like can canon still be a canon? So that's an open question. Number 5 is about the canon and the community and its place in East Asian Buddhism. In the English-speaking world, under the influence of scholars of religion, such as William Cantwell Smith, I just quoted, the Chinese Buddhist canon has been studied under the rubric of the comparative study of sacred texts or scriptures, However, as Paul Ricoeur aptly pointed out 30 years ago, such a anti-historical approach heavily relies on the technique of textual criticism borrowed from biblical studies. So in the field of the sacred texts, so this is basically developed from the Western biblical studies. Moreover, such an approach has fundamentally isolated the canon from the community that constituted it. Right? So the canon actually is a product of community. Right now, our tendency is to isolate the canon from the community itself. So the Ricoeur's concern alerts us to pay more attention to the role of the canon in Buddhist communities. The formation of the Chinese Buddhist canon was deeply rooted in Buddhist community because it was a complicated religious, social, and a textual practice involving collective efforts from the national, local, and personal levels. Religiously, the creation of a canon is a work of faith that involves a series of devotional activities and it can be referred to as the cult of the canon. So I already make this point before, meaning a series of devotional activities involved in the creation, distribution, and maintenance of the canon. Socially, such massive production and distribution of the text are facilitated by various social conditions in a particular time period. Each edition is a project that mobilizes local or even national resources and negotiates its relationship with the state and the local societies. Textually, the canon is a wonderful display of the skillful management of Buddhist knowledge in light of scholarly techniques derived from the Chinese textual tradition. The highly sophisticated cataloging practice and the classification system demonstrated the result of original bibliographical studies of Buddhist texts by Chinese Buddhist monks. Right? So in the previous talk, if you remember, Dr. Albert Walter already singled out 6 different Buddhist strategies towards the Buddhist canon, right? So classification of the teaching, for example, so that's a typical Chinese strategy to classify, to organize the Buddhist canon. The making of a canon was in particular a social practice that involved private and official scriptoria, printing shops, and imperial and gentry patronage, monastic and governmental organizations, nonprofit or commercial distribution. In the pre-modern era, the creation and distribution of the Chinese Buddhist canon was symbolically tied to state power. On the one hand, the compilation and printing of a canon could only be completed with government support because of the amount of resources involved in the project. On the other hand, the official support of the Buddhist canon symbolized the extension of state power into the religious realm. Through these processes, the Buddhist canon acquired a unique character that reflected various dimensions of social relationship, among which we can see a clear interplay of the symbolic power of state authority, the use of technology of production, and the social chain of creation and distribution. To clarify the relationship between the canon and the community requires scholars to be more attentive to these dynamic social relationships rather than being satisfied with superficial descriptions of the canon as a static textual existence. Only through meticulous historical study can we review the role of Buddhist canon in the history of East Asian Buddhism. It is hopeful that a re-examination of the history of the Chinese Buddhism, East Asian Buddhism, through the angle of the canon formation will help us create an alternative historical narrative independent from the sectarian model. Let me come to the last one, number 6, the Chinese canon in comparative perspectives. It has to be remembered that the formation of the Chinese canon is only one instance of canon formation in East Asia and the world religions. To review the nature of a canon formation and to better understand the Chinese canon itself, it is a great need to conduct comparative studies as J.Z. Smith recommends in his following remarks. Here is once again a quotation from his paper. What we have lacked are comparative studies. The attempt to view canons and the processes of canon formation as generic categories in the study of religion. So the study of religion is typical of doing research according to categories. The Chinese canon has three contexts for comparison. So here I'm kind of listing the three I thought about. First, within East Asia, there are different processes of canon formation in different cultural areas. Both Korea and Japan, for example, formed their distinctive canonic cultures and their pattern of canon formation and experiences with a foreign textual tradition. Here it is a Chinese tradition, actually, were different from those of their continental counterpart, the Chinese tradition. Meanwhile, the Chinese canon has to be situated in the process of canon formation in different sectarian backgrounds, as each sectarian movements, such as Chan, Tiantai, tend to focus on their sectarian canons independent of the great canon tradition. Right? So you may recall Professor Albert Walter already pointed this out. In the Chan or Tiantai, they have their own different notion of what is canon for their sectarian purposes. Second, the Chinese canon belongs to the Buddhist canonical tradition, and it can be compared with Tibetan and Nepali traditions. Right? So obviously, this is a Buddhist tradition, so there are lots of overlaps between Tibetan Pali canon and the Chinese canon. Preliminary comparative research shows that although these Buddhist canons share some common characteristics, they differ considerably in their structure and organization. Richard Solomon, for example, a professor from University of Washington, expert in Gandhara Buddhism, points out that the Buddhist canons stand out by its size, diversity, and flexibility, and share similar techniques such as selecting, abridging, and anthologizing texts. However, each tradition is different about its conception, their conception, and the organization of the canon. Some more restrictive, such as the Pali canon, some more inclusive and encyclopedic, such as the Chinese canon tradition. Such comparative work has not yet begun and will generate exciting discoveries regarding the characteristics and the nature of the Buddhist canon in general. Finally, in the scope of world religions, the study of the Chinese Buddhist canon can be furthered by the comparative study of sacred texts and canon formation in world religion. Although attempts have been made in the past among the comparative studies of sacred texts, much can be done based on in-depth studies of each tradition. So this is the last point I want to make, because we want to further open up the canon. So then it is necessary for us to compare the Chinese canonical tradition with other Buddhist canonical tradition, and further with the world religious canonical traditions as well. So let me conclude my talk here. So here I have a short concluding remarks. The Buddhist canon is no longer confined to religious communities. Rather, it has become a legitimate field of research in humanities. The field of humanities today has become increasingly interdisciplinary. It provides new tools such as digital humanities and literary analysis to study complex subjects such as the Buddhist canon. In the process of reinventing the humanities, research on the Buddhist canon can play a positive role, allowing scholars to experiment with different research methods. This new path of humanities research can also help to preserve the Buddhist canon as a body of cultural heritage and allow it to enter a broader network of information among scholars and tertiary institutions. Many people have discussed about the decline of humanities in recent decades, and the COVID pandemic seems to have worsened this declining trend. Some may suggest that the humanities may vanish or disappear. However, I think the pandemic provides a great opportunity for the humanities because this crisis has spurred us all to reflect upon the priceless value and also limitation, fragility of human life. The Buddhist canon is such a treasure house that has created a centralizing spiritual force amid this decentralizing world. By working together, humanities scholars can look at the Buddhist canon from a humanistic perspective beyond merely bibliographical and textual approaches. In this way, both Buddhists and humanities scholars have the potential to open up new opportunities for each other. This new strategy, energetic synergy, may generate a new paradigm of research, teaching, and outreach for higher education. In 2014, I attended a AAR, so this is Association Academy of the American Religion panel on Buddhist scriptures in the Canon in San Diego. But by the way, this year I attended online the AAR meetings. So my impression from the presented papers and the panel discussion confirms my observation that the interests in canon studies and the role of the sacred scriptures are growing. However, there remains suspicion and skepticism about the validity of the use of the very term canon as a useful category for study, which Dr. Louis Lancaster has alluded and I quoted in the beginning. I would call this kind of academic arrogance because scholars' daily handling of Buddhist texts give us a false sense of erudition in front of a vastly complicated textual tradition. However, as Charlie Hallisey, a scholar of Southeast Asian Buddhism at Harvard Divinity School, who also presented a paper on Buddhaghosa's view on scripture, reminds us that we should remain humble when talk about scripture in the canon. So here is his quote here. So let me skip this. I think we're approaching the end of my talk. I have used up too much time. So let me conclude, right? So this is real conclusion. Let me conclude by looking towards the future of canon study. We should stress that the Chinese Buddhist canon is a living tradition. In East Asia, the canon remains central to Buddhist religious life, especially when the tradition is undergoing significant transmission and the Buddhists need to go back to scriptures and canons to seek their spiritual roots and textual authority. We anticipate that the tradition of the Chinese Buddhist canon will continue to evolve with time and serve as core of a Buddhist tradition in East Asia and beyond. Right now, there are too little Western literature on the history of the Chinese canon, and many more needs to be done to explore the formation and transformation of the tradition. This exploration of key issues I just outlined in this talk is the initial step to provide an overview of the history and the content of the canon, and to invite serious discussion about the critical issues in the study of this great textual tradition. Thank you very much. So this is basically my talk here. Sorry for the time. Yes, so thank you.